1.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, JAG members and guests, to our September 2021. Losing track of the years now, I'm realizing. I think that, I don't know about you all, but the Olympics threw me off where I kept seeing 2020 and knowing it was 2021. So it's good to see everyone. I'm glad that, though we weren't able to get to see each other in person, always happy the fact that we're all able to be present. And so happy to see folks are here and are well. So as well as can be expected given our current conditions. So we have a lot of things on our agenda, and I want to go ahead and get us started. So I really want to, particularly the certain agenda items, we need to have some good, rich discussion to guide us in our next steps. So with that being said, well, let's start with our first agenda items in terms of approval of the agenda and the minutes from our last meeting. Can I get a motion?
So moved.
So yes, I got Joe and I got Euphemia first and second. So there we go. We have our first and second motions. All in favor of approving the agenda and minutes from our last meeting, say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed or abstentions? I think so. All right. So we have approved our minutes from our last meeting. The next is our 2020 JAG Annual Report. We want to open this up for a little discussion and thoughts or reactions that folks may have had regards the report that outlines the activities of the JAG. Any thoughts, reactions that folks may have as they reviewed the annual report?
Well done. Lots of information.
Yes.
Happy to get it over the finish line.
Yeah.
Yes. It's been a journey for this report. I also want to say that I think given the time frame that's included in this report, that includes the sort of moments in leading up to not only in terms of moving into the quarantine sort of beginning, but also the attention to and not just the attention, but the consideration around the race equity work. And I think given sort of what we're thinking about strategic plan moving forward, I appreciated sort of seeing this again to sort of reflect on the importance of what we're also planning forward for our next 3 years. So kudos to the development report. Yes.
Yeah. Again, I think it's extremely well done and very thorough. So I don't think you need to change anything. The one thing that I'd like to see, and whether it's in here or someplace else, is the discussion of the regional youth justice teams.
Mm.
And in particular, what I would love to see at some point is a couple of paragraphs that kind of summarize and integrate what's going on, because you read each one and there's so many different things going on. It's hard to get a feel for overall what kind of impact that's happening. So some sort of cross-cutting summary of what we're learning from all of them, but also where the key areas are. And again, I don't think you need it for this, but I think that would be very helpful for us.
That's a great point. Thanks for raising that, Joe.
Yeah.
Right. If there are no other comments, let's see here. We're going to move to approve the annual report. Could I get a motion? See Emily. Can I get a second? I see Alan. All right. All in favor of approving the 2020 JAG Annual Report, say aye or raise your hand. Yeah,
Aye.
right. Wonderful. Any abstentions or denials of the annual report? Nope. All right. The JAG 2020 annual report has been approved. All right. We're moving in a nice clip. So the next item, which is one of the big items that we carve out some time for, is the staff updates, particularly regarding federal funding and the Title II application. I'm going to turn this over. Where am I? I'm looking.
So we have Maura Gagan, who's going to be presenting today.
Okay.
Jeff was unable to make it today.
I'm like looking. I'm like, where is Jeff? But happy to see you, Maura.
Yes,
Maura?
Maura.
Okay.
Hey, everybody. Good afternoon or good morning. My name's Maura Gagan. I used to work on the JJ funding for a few years, and I've been out of the JJ world for about a year, but they've pulled me back in. So bear with me. I just started working on back on these funding charts last week, and I'm stepping in for Jeff today. But so if you look at the funding charts that we provide you guys, usually every meeting, we have the summary award sheet. That's got the blue bar at the top. If you look at that, you'll see that we're fully programmed. The 16, 17, 18, and 19 awards are all fully programmed to date. So right now we have funding available about 1.8 million on the 2020 award and about 1.7 million on the 2021 award. As you know, the litigation around Sanctuary City has been resolved, but we still have to work with the feds to clear up a few other compliance type issues to get the 19 and 20 money flowing again. But from what I understand, our conversations with the feds so far have been good. So we don't expect that to go on too much longer, but there are still some T's to cross and I's to dot before that money can be available to us to start spending. One of the things would be compliance with the SAG roster, for example. But so we're working on that. So the funding that you see there that's available, the 3.5 total, that's all available through 2024 and 2025. Plus we, expected extensions. So we should have enough time to spend that money down. And if you look at the second sheet that has the details behind the commitments, it just kind of shows you how we've broken out some of that funding across the different funding years. The only thing under 2020 right now that's committed is some money for the YJI, the Youth Justice Institute. I think that's it, unless Tom, have I missed anything?
I do have a question, if it's okay for me to ask, and I don't know who the question actually goes to, but it's great to hear that the sort of the barrier that we have in order to obtain the money has been resolved. Do you mind speaking a little bit of the outcome of that, just for information background?
You mean the Sanctuary City litigation?
Yes.
Yep, so the again, this is Jeff Bender, might be better at it, but the lawsuits were, I believe they were withdrawn by the Department of Justice under the new Biden administration. So the lawsuits that the states had brought against the federal government were withdrawn, and the federal government is no longer imposing those special conditions regarding sanctuary cities.
The only other thing that I'll add is, as you may recall, the FY20 funding was held up for some time based on some of those conditions, and we were able to get that cleared up, and were invited to apply for supplemental application, I think is what they called it. And the nice thing about it was they invited us to apply for a larger amount than we were originally able to apply for. So we're able to apply for roughly $2.6 million. That may have something to do with some reallocations that were going on in the federal government. I don't think we're clear on exactly why that happened, but it'll provide us with roughly $500,000 extra for the 2020 funding once that's awarded. And we're still, obviously waiting to hear back on the 21 application. As you know, the federal fiscal year ends September 30th. So we're hoping to hear very shortly on that.
Thanks, Tom. I forgot to mention that.
Okay. Any other questions on the funding charts? All right. Thanks, Maura.
Yes, thank you. So this is, this is really good news and important information for us to have as we move forward, particularly when we get into our conversation around furthering our strategic action plan. So I don't know about you all, but that's exciting that we're in a very different place than we were a couple of years ago, or even last year, in terms of a big old question mark as to what are the means that the JAG will have available in terms of continuing to pursue youth justice reform work that we have plotted out in our plan. So very exciting. I'm going to do my hooray dance. Right? So, but obviously it becomes now a matter of, as a JAG, how do we bring to life our strategic action plan? So, so we have quite a few items that we want to discuss here today. We're going to go to our next item. If there aren't any more questions regarding the federal funding and the Title II application, we are going to discuss the Youth Action Committee, which was one of our funding priorities that we commenced in our most recent meeting. So, Tom.
Yes, I'm going to turn it over to, I believe Nyasia is going to give us an update on that, or Shalane will direct us in that manner there.
Actually, I believe I was going to sort of give the brief
All
update
right.
what we have been working on. But Nyasia, Jason, please feel free to step in. I'm pretty sure I'm going to forget something, so it's always good to have a backup. So since it was approved, the funds for this committee, we have been meeting bi-weekly. With the exception of by the end of summer, we did took like a brief break, about a month. And what we have been working on, it's pretty much sort of building the foundation of what is it that we want to do, what we want this committee to be, right? So that includes the mission, the vision, the values, what is it that we want to work on, kind of like projects, what support, professional development do we need, do we would like to even sort of provide feedback and say like, this is where we want funding to go to. We are currently in the works of building or trying to have a gathering for about a day or two so we can meet and have like more strategic planning on it. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it on where we are at the moment. There is some draft of some of the work that we have been building, but we don't want to give you guys the rough draft. We want to give you guys a close to an end draft. So, hopefully by the next time we meet, we're able to provide some documents so you guys can see where we are.
All right, thank you. Others on the committee. I know it's not easy to work during the summer to try to pull some, so it's I applaud you all for doing what you can to kind of get this ball rolling.
Thank you. We've been meeting bi-weekly, trying to get as much time together as we can.
All right. Go ahead.
Yeah, so these past couple of meetings that we have all met together, it's mostly really initially getting to know more of each other and why we are in this actual field, what our actual goals are. So that way we can, all of us as a collective can get one mission statement together on what we feel like is truly important, not only to us individually, but as a group, and to JAG as well. So one of the important factors was, because I know before I was actually on this board, I had no idea that it was even here. So I think one of the important factors that we would want to do with this committee is really increase the presence of JAG and let people know that we are here, especially when it comes to the youth. So that way we can just build a better relationship with the public and things of that nature.
That's great to hear, especially knowing that that's also part of our strategic action plan, right? That communication piece. So I love that you all are also attentive to that reality. Any questions, thoughts, reactions from other JAG members?
Eddie, this is Bob. I'd just like to say to the members of the Youth Action Committee that, I want you to hear it from the JAG members that we are so looking forward to your input. Your voices are important. I've been a member of the JAG for 20 years now, and so I'm a long-term member. And I want to say that, I want you to hear us clearly that your input, your voices are really important. So we look forward to the work that you have. We think it's of great value. So thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Wonderful. Well, we are excited. We're glad that you all are going to find some time to do some strategic planning yourselves, even in this sort of environment that we're currently in. And so we look forward to updates at our next JAG meeting. So we're going to now shift over to the Youth Justice Institute. Oh, there we go.
All right, thanks so much, Eddie, and hello, everybody. It's great to see you. Thank you for your continued support, for the opportunity to share some updates here today. In today's meeting, we would like to focus our presentation on 3 items: the Policy Equity Academy, the COVID-19 and Youth Forum that we held this summer, and we would like to seize the opportunity to introduce you to our new team members. Let's get started with the Policy Equity Academy, which has been underway since late June virtually. I believe the CJS made available to you the application packet that we sent to select counties in New York State, but if you don't have that handy, it should be dropped in chat right about now. But to give us a deeper understanding of the Academy and a broader overview of it, I would like to turn our attention to Avery Irons, our Associate for Training and Technical Assistance here at the YJI, to dive a little bit deeper into that for us. Avery, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's good to see you all again and a pleasure to be back and talking to you about the launch of our Policy Equity Academy, this inaugural academy for New York State. We are hosting it in partnership with the Office of Youth Justice at DCJS. And the Academy brings together 5 counties that were selected this spring by competitive application to build knowledge and skills around racial and ethnic disparities and to create action plans to decrease disparities at the probation adjustment system point. This first cohort of counties includes Albany, Monroe, Onondaga, Schenectady, Westchester, and there's also a team participating from the Office of Probation and Correctional Alternatives. The Academy's goals and objectives are to increase the number of youth of color with special attention to Black youth receiving, engaging, and successfully completing adjustment services, and decreasing the number of youth of color who are referred to the presentment agency by petition. So the contracted instructors are from the Center for Children's Law and Policy, who had previously worked with OIJ on designing the Academy's curriculum. The course is virtual using mixed formats, with CCLP delivering 4 live training sessions in August and September, so we're about halfway through with those right now. And participants are also using a learning management system called Absorb that the YJI built out specifically for this course. This LMS is similar to Blackboard and Moodle if you've used those before, and it houses the course materials, the knowledge assessments, assignments, and discussion spaces. The sessions and coursework are targeted to increase the participants' substantive knowledge and to build a scaffold for a practical planning process that will result in the development of a local level action plan for each county. Between October and January, the counties will deepen their planning and begin implementing their action plans. In February, the sites will come back together for an additional live session module. They'll be responsive to issues they've encountered so far and also create opportunities for cross-county discussion and processing. The counties will then receive technical assistance for 12 to 18 months and funding of up to $50,000 to support implementation of their action plans. Throughout this process, there are evaluation and assessment points, our plans to help us understand ways to improve the course with an eye toward future cohorts of counties going through the academy. And through impact assessments, we will also look for any indicators and changes in rates of successful diversion at both the state and local levels. Now I will turn it over to my colleagues to update on our COVID-19 and youth work. Alicia Gagnon is one of our YJI research fellows, and Tierney Nash is one of our Bridges scholars.
Hello, good morning, everybody. So this last summer, we had the opportunity to brief you on the discussions held during our first COVID-19 and youth Are the Kids All Right forum. And we have a big thank you to the University at Albany for the funding and support to this and last year's forum. Also, a quick thank you to Judge Mendelson, Jason Williams, Shalane Garcia, and Trista Deem for your participation in our process this past year. At that time, we indicated that we would be holding another forum this year, in 2021. This one more narrowly focused on the top 3 areas of interest that were identified in the first forum. Those topic areas were education during and after the pandemic as a protective factor of vulnerable youth, assessing and sustaining positive court-based adaptations, and youth and community trauma and healing through a racial and ethnic disparities lens. To facilitate our better understanding of the pressing issues in each of these areas, we recruited expert advisory groups who met over the course of the spring earlier this year. We organized these meetings as an iterative process of group-based conversations and brainstorming, followed by review of resources and coming back together to discuss. Several themes emerged from these conversations, which were later complemented by the discussions held during the forum itself. We're now going to highlight the main themes discussed in each of these areas with an emphasis on sustainability. Tierney, take it away.
Thanks, Alicia. So the 2021 advisory process and forum resulted in several different recommendations for next steps as we look beyond 2020. Across all 3 of our focus areas here, the experts and panelists urge stakeholders to prioritize youth psychological safety as much as their physical safety has been prioritized in the past. The participants also emphasized the need to intentionally foster cultural humility and improve youth, family, and community engagement. The court's participants recommended further exploration and integration of procedural justice in both the virtual and the in-person processes, the establishment of research court collaborations focused on reforms, and the elimination of racial and ethnic disparities, as well as the need to move away from a single system solution driven focus towards a multi-system approach and collaboration. On this point, they noted that systems need to work together to understand the pathways youth and families may have taken during these years. As an example, perhaps youth did not touch the juvenile justice system, but they did interact with the child welfare system or mental health systems. The education group also urged the issuance of state-level guidance on virtual learning to ensure that students were not pushed out of in-person learning and back into the virtual classrooms. They also advocated for sustaining smaller class sizes and de-emphasizing the one-size curriculum and success metrics. I'm going to pass it back to Alicia.
Thank you. Both the education and trauma and healing groups emphasized the need to proactively use healing and restorative practices as students return to this in-person learning to build and repair relationship infrastructures and protect students from being pushed out of school based on trauma-related behaviors that many students will display during this transition. In addition to this, the trauma and healing experts called on leaders and systems to recognize and scale up the organic manifestations of community healing that are frequently used, such as art, support circles, vigils, etc., and to begin the processes for system accountability for past harms to marginalized and oppressed communities. In line with our attendance last year, we had approximately 500 registrations per session, with more than 1,500 registrations total. And as we've said in the past, it's important that we regularly measure the impact of our trainings and gauge the satisfaction of our participants to resolve issues and continually improve the trainings we offer. Our success in our virtual delivery is captured in our audience's responses, a sample of which is on the screen now. Our audience said, "What a great way to look at reframing, by not giving excuses or ignoring bad events, but rather expand how we see a situation to understand why events happen." I loved the way we heard from older panelists as well as the young adult panelists, and each drew on the strengths of each other. Next slide, please. On the whole, our participants found that the panels were informative and rated them as excellent or very good. 93% of people indicated that the information from the panels would be useful for their work. Over 95% of people found the panel sessions informative, and 93% of respondents enjoyed the panel sessions. Notably, 95% of respondents said that they would be interested in future YJI events and or want to subscribe to our monthly On the Same Page publication. We also took this as an opportunity to gather information regarding areas for technical assistance and research areas of interest from our participants, many of which align with the themes Tierney and I mentioned and will help inform our next projects and could potentially be of use to you, the JJAG. There are definitely points of alignment between these themes and some of the goals, the JJAG, that were developed in last year's strategic action planning process. These will be reflected in the issue brief that we plan on publishing later this month. You'll be receiving that publication as soon as it is ready, and we would welcome your thoughts then. Meanwhile, if you missed either the 2020 or the 2021 forums and would like to watch the panels, you can do so on our YJI YouTube channel. The link will be in the chat momentarily. And now I'll turn it back to Giza to introduce you to the newest YJI team members.
Thanks so much, Alicia. Before we move on to the introductions, we wanted to take a moment to celebrate a milestone with you. We're now mostly back in person in the office in a hybrid schedule. And with this very, very big team that we have right now, we are now also occupying additional space within the School of Criminal Justice. I have to say that after operating fully virtually for so long, it feels really nice to be able to collaborate in person and to make space for spontaneous conversations and exchange of ideas. So as soon as we're allowed to have guests back on campus, we would love to have you there for a quick tour of the new space. Now on to introductions. To help deliver on the Institute's mission, with your support, the support of our partnering agencies, and the support given by the university, we've been able to increase our research and TA capacity by adding to the team 2 additional graduate research assistants, as well as an experienced research associate. Dr. Toni Cruz, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here virtually and seeing all of your faces. So as Jesus said, my name is Toni Cruz. I have my PhD in social psychology from the University of Nevada, Reno. However, I also have training in sociology and anthropology. So I consider myself interdisciplinary. And my research primarily focuses on criminal justice topics. So my dissertation was based on procedural justice and interactions between judges and youth. And that's something that's very interesting to me. While I was working on my PhD, I worked as a graduate research assistant at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, as well as the Grant Sawyer Center for Justice Studies, among other positions. And as an undergrad, I worked in a group. I was a direct care worker in a group home. for at-risk youth, which ultimately inspired my research and ultimately drove me to this job, or drew me to this job. So next you will hear from one of our new graduate research assistants, Toni Cruz. Toni, you're up.
Thank you, Tori. Hi, everybody. My name is Toni. It's nice to see some familiar faces and then plenty of new ones today. As Tori said, I'm one of the new graduate research assistants here at the YJI. I'm also currently a PhD student in the Department of Sociology, and I hold a master's degree in sociology from San Diego State University. During my time at UAlbany, I've served as a teaching assistant and teaching fellow for the Department of Sociology, as well as the School of Criminal Justice. And my research interests focus broadly on the intersections of family, race, and crime, with specific interests in studying the effects of parental incarceration and the drivers of legal cynicism among youth. And now I'd like to go ahead and pass it to Megan.
Hi everyone, my name is Megan, and I'm also excited to be here and to introduce myself to you a little bit today. So I'm a new graduate research assistant at the YJI and a current PhD candidate in the School of Criminal Justice at the University of Albany. I also received my Master of Arts in Criminal Justice from UAlbany in 2017. Before coming to the YJI this summer, I worked as a graduate teaching instructor for the past several years and taught 2 courses on gender and crime and on cross-national crime. During my master's degree, I also worked as a graduate assistant at the Office of Justice and Research Performance within DCJS, reporting primarily on programs identified as alternatives to incarceration. My research centers on the causes of gender-based violence and the role of intersectional identities in victimization risks. I also utilize comparative and mixed qualitative and quantitative methods in my work. Lastly, I have been greatly enjoying working with our new scholars at the YJI this semester. I'm excited to be part of this team, which has had 30 scholars over the past 2 years. Now I will pass it back to Giza to wrap up.
Thanks so much, Megan. And thank you all again for this opportunity to share a few updates. I'd like to close with an announcement and an invitation. So the announcement first. As you may have heard, we're actively recruiting a seasoned youth specialist for the Institute, and this person will help us design, recruit, and implement our very first Youth Advisory Board. Please help us spread the word about this position. Right about now, a link to the job description should be dropped in the chat. Finally, on to the invitation. Among the materials that were circulated for this meeting was a report of the first year of the online trainings we've been holding at the YJI, our Lunch and Learn series. These webinars are really, really well attended and are quite diverse in topics. Last month, we focused on trauma with a presentation by Dr. Keith Cruz. And next month, we will continue to focus on that theme. The next presenter is Dr. Sean Marsh, who is Professor of Judicial Studies, Communication Studies, and Social Psychology at the University of Nevada, Reno. And he'll be joining us on Thursday, October 14th at 12 p.m. So please save the date and time. We'll be circulating information on how to register for that session soon in our newsletter. And we hope very much to see you there. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
All right. Thank you so much, Giza, and the YJI team for sharing a plethora of information around sort of what's the stuff you all have been doing. I had a question. I wrote it down, but I think you all may have answered it in terms of your issue brief, because the information I think you provided, I'm viewing it from the vantage point of, as JAG members, we're going to be wanting to sit in a place where we can consume information like this on a regular basis during not only our JAG meetings, but also in between. So I wondered about some type of sort of policy memos or issue briefs from these types of convenings that you all would be making available so that we can, love the YouTube channel. But I think I'm back to printing stuff out and reading, and I'm eager to read some stuff.
Eddie, you and me the same here. It's coming. We're in the last review process here of the issue brief for the last forum. And the one that I was holding just now is the one from last year. So what we hope to send to you all is a nice packet with both issue briefs. And hopefully, very much like last year, put together a video of the highlights of the points that were made, 2.5 minutes max.
Thank you. I see there's a question in the chat from Euphemia. Is there an age requirement for the youth position?
Hi, Euphemia. Thank you so much for this question. So right now we're recruiting the youth specialist who we hope will help us design the recruitment strategy for all the youth members that will be part of the board. And we hope to get the input of this person as well as the executive committee of the YJI to figure out what is the age group that we want to focus on and what makes sense. And we would love your input as well. If you have ideas and suggestions of what age group we should be focusing on, please do let us know.
Other questions? My last question, I can't remember, I may have missed it in the description of the Policy Equity Academy. I know you all said that there's 5 counties that are participating, right? What is the representation in terms of stakeholders who are sort of part of those counties, right? Is it appears to be sort of a multidisciplinary sort of attention to discussing policy issues and the relevance of sort of maintaining an equity lens in that work. But I'm wondering, like, who are the set of stakeholders who are sitting at those county tables that are going to be participating?
Thanks for this, Eddie. I do think one of the strengths of the teams is their holistic nature. I'm going to invite Avery to share a little bit about how we recruited the testimonials that people had to provide us with and their best intentions in participating in this academy, as well as answer your question more fully. Avery?
Absolutely. So counties that have the highest numbers of disparities, specifically at the probation adjustment point, were those who were invited to participate. So there was, I think the invitation went out to about 10 counties, and this was selected between many partners at DCJS to make sure that the counties we're bringing in, if successful, will have a huge impact, a felt impact on their numbers at the local level and also at the state level if they successfully divert more young people. So probation is the lead, which is the required lead for any county to apply. And then within the teams, we suggested that they had, I think we said, 8 to 10. We ended up with teams giving us many more than that, which I was glad to see that was showing interest in their county. But so there's probation, law enforcement. Most counties have schools. There's some mental health. There's community providers that are kind of specific to the counties. We suggested that each county, look at a list of stakeholders that we thought were important to attend and participate, but however, really figure out who needs to be in their room to solve the problems for their specific county. So some counties have judges who are participating, and all teams were required to have a youth and family representative participate as well. And each person had to submit their kind of basic information while also filling out a personal statement to explain why they wanted to participate in this process and their commitment to the process, so that hopefully this is not just a come and get the certificate, but we really expect people and want people to commit for the full 18 months and hopefully beyond, but so that we can have teams intact who are making active progress on this issue over the next 1.5 years at least.
That's great. It's great to hear that there's a great diversity of folks on there, and also sort of levels of commitment. Um, so I have sort of two more questions. Sorry, I'm just curious because as we see this academy, it's as a generative opportunity for folks to really sort of deepen the work that that's going on in their counties. We want to make sure that it has the right spirit of sort of folks, and I'm glad to hear that you all asked for sort of personal statements from a variety of folks. Are you finding that in some of these counties that there is a general balance of sort of all these different set of stakeholders, or is there sort of one agencies being more represented than others?
It's a good question. I mean, there's nothing that struck me as unbalanced thus far. It feels pretty even in terms of, I mean, we wanted probation to be the lead agency, so since it's a probation adjustment point that we're looking at, but I think they did a really good job of really thinking through in terms of building their team who should be there. So nothing has felt like there's not enough community, or there's too much law enforcement or too much schools. Yeah, it has felt pretty even so far. I mean, I don't know if other folks who are, at OYJ or Giza wants to weigh in on that if they have a different sense.
Yeah, I think that having been now attending the academy and observing in a sort of detached way, one thing that struck me as really interesting is the safe space that's being created for discussions about difficult topics. And what was made clear to me is that regardless of perhaps overrepresentation of one agency or another in one county or another, it seems like everybody made space to speak up, share their vulnerabilities, and connect with that very important, I think, raw aspect of the work so that they can then learn and move forward. So from my perspective, watching how it's being presented by CCLP with their expertise, it's been really interesting to see how effective it is, despite these potential imbalances.
So, and that touches on my second question, and I'm going to stop hogging the mic. So what is, given the nature of what the academy is going to be doing in centering patterns of racial ethnic disparities, I'm wondering about the racial, ethnic, and gender diversity that lives in the academy. What are you seeing or experiencing?
I think we can get you exact numbers on that, actually, so I don't have to guess. But I mean, I have, it feels pretty representational, I would say. I'm trying to think. Yeah, let me just get the exact numbers, Eddie, because I don't want to guess. And it feels, I've been impressed by who's come so far. But I don't want to guess people's ethnicities and races, but it feels relatively diverse.
Right. Okay, good. Thank you. Other questions, thoughts, reactions?
Hey, this is Bob again. So I wanted to say that, of course, DCJS has an OPCA team participating as well, in addition to YJ, Office of Youth Justice, OIJ. But this is important for us as well because we're learning along with the counties. The idea being that we would then be able to send our juvenile probation operations units into the counties to work with them, and specifically around the subject, which is the subject matter of the Policy Equity Academy, is probation intake and adjustment. That is the focus of the Policy Equity Academy, that we're focusing on intake and adjustment. And I think that's so important because it's an area that holds great promise in adjusting matters that come to the attention of authorities through arrests and come to the family court. But long before those cases, are promoted or advanced terms of a petition to family court, probation has great authority where the case is eligible and suitable for adjustment to actually adjust those cases through the provision of services. And that's really, really important. There's a lot that goes into it. I won't go into the detail now, but there's a great opportunity here for us to work with the departments, not only the 5 that are participating in the Policy Equity Academy, but the high volume jurisdictions, and there are others as well, to see real change in terms of outcomes for young people, and certainly a reduction in cases going on to petition to the court. So I thought that was significant to mention.
Definitely. Thank you so much for saying that, Bob. Others? All right. Well, thank you so much, YJI, for your, again, sort of being thoughtful around sort of giving us good sets of information. And I always love the team effort that you all put into everything that you do. It's really appreciated to kind of see that ongoing sort of collaboration.
Thanks, Eddie, and thanks, everybody.
Yes. All right. So now we're going to move on to the Snug Street Outreach Program.
Yes, thank you, Eddie. So we are going to introduce you to Erica Mendelson and Jeff Clark, who are going to be going through a brief presentation for you on this one.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jeff Clark. I'm the New York State SNUG Director.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erica Mendelson, and I'm the Director of the SNUG Social Work Case Management Program. And I'm going to share a PowerPoint now. And Jeff, I'll click through this while you speak.
All right. Well, welcome, everybody. SNUG used to operate at DCJS under the Public Safety Office, and we moved over to Deputy Commissioner Baycoat's office because I think our program kind of lines up a little bit better with the Office of Youth Justice. We started SNUG at DCJS for its full oversight back in 2013. Well, the very end of 2013. And we started with 2 sites. We're now up to 12. I would say every year we are seeing increases in cities that would like us to be present with our SNUG outreach staff. And I fully expect that that number of 12 will probably grow over the next few years. We have our main goal, and again, that's how we're aligned with the GIVE, Gun Involved Violence Elimination Project. Our main goal is to reduce gun violence. So that's primarily why we have this program. And I think, and Eric will explain a little bit further in this presentation, but I think we've really kind of evolved into not just gun violence, but treating gun violence like a disease. So we have to not only prepare for looking at gun violence as a disease and finding out who the transmitters are and applying some cure to it, but we also have to apply cure to the community, and that's where our social work side comes in. So our main purpose was to deal with the highest risk youth within our community, and in doing so, we really have tried to hire in each of the 12 cities and I'll show that on the next screen, but in each of the 12 cities, we're trying to hire people that reflect their community, are deeply involved in their community, have turned their lives around, and in some way probably have had something to do with the criminal justice system, either positive or negative, and use that to be able to reach the youth that are out there right now, that are involved in the daily violence that we've unfortunately come to accept as in our daily lives. So we started in 2014. I was asked to oversee the initial program. It started in 2010 with basically a $5 million grant for 2 years, and they found 10 cities to operate it in. It dropped off after a couple short years to just 2 cities, and like I said, since then we've been working to really make it grow, especially in the cities that have had some severe violence, mainly in upstate New York. Go to the next one. So these are the 12 cities. You have your upstate cities of Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Albany, and Troy, and then Middle Hudson of Newburgh and Poughkeepsie, and then the downstate ones with Long Island, and the only one that we have actually in the New York City area is the Jacoby Bronx site. But those are the 12 cities that we are operating within. The sites have a variety of staffing. Our biggest site is probably the one in Buffalo, along with the one in the Bronx. And they have between 9 and 10 staff members there. Our smallest sites are in Newburgh and in Mount Vernon, and they have a staff of 4 in each of those sites. Go to the next slide. So essentially, we connect ourselves to the each of those cities through a community-based organization. So the only one that we have 2 sites through is Albany and Troy, and they're through Trinity Alliance. Everybody else has an individual site within their community that usually has some sort of tentacles having to do with social work and services provided to the community to help people in impoverished parts of the city, as well as victims and as well as people that need help. So you can see the agencies that are listed here. When we started this back in 2014, the sites that we had, there was only one site that was actually hospital-based, and that was the Bronx Jacoby Medical Center. Since then, that was kind of our flagship site where it was very new, very innovative. We have, and we still currently have, a doctor on site at Jacoby who is a pediatrics doctor, Dr. Noe Romo, and he is considered part-time with us, so we're paying for 1 day a week, but he's with us a lot more than that. And we also hired Erica, who is now working for the state, but at that time, she was the program manager for our site down in Jacoby. And due to their work, especially Erica, we're trying to replicate a lot of the work that was getting done in the Bronx in other cities. We've since expanded pretty much in a similar model in Buffalo, and we do have connections to Albany Medical and Syracuse Upstate. When Rochester gets back up and running, we hope to have a similar partnership there as well, so that we're really kind of at these level 1 trauma centers doing a warm, what we call a warm handoff. So if a victim is shot, brought into the hospital, our Snug staff deals with them, our social work staff may deal with them, and when they get released from the hospital, we'll continue that work with them to make sure that they don't continue to be a victim of a crime or a victim of a shooting. Our sites are set up as the diagram shows here. We have a site administrator that is usually just an administrator from that particular agency, the community-based agency, who would work part-time as the oversight. Our program manager is really our on the Snug outreach side of things. They're the ones getting a lot of the community work done, as well as management. We also have, as you can see, a straight across social worker who Erica can explain, the social worker and case manager further in the project. But we have on the outreach side of things, this outreach supervisor who then supervises the street outreach workers. And for the most part, our street outreach workers are working hours that allow them to be out at night, dealing with our highest risk youth, but also being available during the day to take those highest risk youth out to agencies and referrals that will help them with their conditions, whether it be to get a license, to get ID, to get a job, to get an education, to get drug or mental health services. So those are all when we hire a street outreach worker, we're really trying to find someone to connect with those highest risk youth and get them the services that they need as quickly as we can and get them out of the street. You go to the next one. So our highest risk youth, these bullets that you see here are really what we're looking for in dealing with highest risk youth. However, if you're 13 years old and you're carrying a gun, or if you're 30 years old and you're carrying a gun, or you're involved in street gun violence, we readily accept you as well. But the main people that we're working with are that 14 to 25 years of age. And, they're active in a street organization, gangs, cliques, groups, through school, through their neighborhood, through a nationwide gang, however they might be involved. They usually would have a history of violence and engaged in high-risk activity, such as other crimes, carrying a weapon. The main one that we're looking at for each of our Snug participants is someone that is a weapons carrier. If they're known to have access to or have a weapon, those are the people that in an instant make life-altering decisions for not only themselves, but for the people that they might be engaged with. And that's where we really try to focus our attention on. Also, people who have been recently shot, whether it's retaliation or whether it's trying to earn back their reputation or just, being mad at the world after having taken a bullet and having something debilitating happen to them. They are a good target audience for us as well. And we also have people, constantly getting released from prison and for whatever they went to prison for. If they shot somebody or robbed somebody or were involved in some sort of conspiracy involving a gang, when they get out, a lot of the time the problem that they went in for is back there to greet them as they get out, because they're released to the usually the area that they were in prison or before they were in prison. You can go to the next one. So one of the things that our outreach staff is, what I feel is a talent that is really unique, is that we do a lot of work with teaching them how to do conflict mediations between someone in a gang, between a youth, between you know, a lover's triangle, whatever it might be. We try to insert ourselves into those situations before they get violent, and we're talking people down, making them aware of what situations can grow into and how quickly those situations can turn ugly and life-altering. So we spend a lot of time, whether it's motivational interviewing, whether it's just conflict mediation, but we spend a lot of time training our staff in being able to do conflict mediations. We do it as safe as we can. We usually have more than one person involved in that conflict mediation, but I think one of the things that having people from the community that were in a target area for, that know that area, that they're getting information, whether it's through social media, whether it's through just word on the street, or things that they see while they're canvassing, but they find out what is going on in the city, or they're getting involved after a shooting takes place and find out what the shooting was about. I personally think our most effective tool that we have in our toolbox is, first of all, being able to mediate conflict, but also we're in a position where we're being contacted by the police within 2 hours of a shooting. We can get to the hospital, we can get to the victim of a crime, we can get to their family or their friends or their gang members and try to squash retaliation before it starts. And I think that's where we have our best impact on a day-to-day basis. And it's very hard to quantify the work that we do in terms of how many shootings did we stop. But I know every one of our outreach workers can tell you stories where they know that they stopped a shooting from taking place just by getting that person to pause and think about what it is that they were going to do. So on my end of things, one of the last things that we're constantly involved in is making the community aware of the shootings that take place. You know, I would say in the 70s or even in the early 80s, you know, a shooting would take place and then we get a lot of news coverage. Nowadays, shootings are so plentiful that you're lucky if they make the newspaper or if they make the nightly news. Our goal is to still make people aware of the shootings, every victim, whether they were a gang member or an innocent bystander. We treat each shooting with the same respect that someone in our community was shot. We want to make the community aware of it, and we want to raise our youth to not want to be involved in any more of the shootings. So we do a lot of barbecues, we do a lot of marches, we do a lot of canvassing, we do shooting responses to make communities aware of it. When a shooting takes place, on every single shooting, we respond within 72 hours to that community to make sure that they're aware that the shooting did take place. And sometimes the victims' families come out with us. Sometimes we have, you know, community members from churches that come out with us and show unity in that community, whether it's a 3-year-old innocent bystander that was shot or a 25-year-old gun-toting gang member that was shot. We try to give it the same exposure to that community. So I'm going to pass this over to Erica, who actually came up with this particular screenshot here, because I think it really does work well for the outreach side of things and the social work side of things, all being under the same umbrella, because we're all aiming at the same goal here. So, Erica.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So as Jeff was just mentioning, we have the Snug program, which started with the outreach side of things. And in 2019, we added the social work case management piece of the program, which I'm going to speak about now. But I want to make sure it's clear to everybody that the outreach side and the social work case management side, we're all part of the same team. We're all under the Snug umbrella. And the only way that the social work case management team can be successful is if they're well integrated within what was usually the already existing outreach team when they joined. So it's the core of Snug is street outreach, and the social work case management piece is an addition to the team that brings a different kind of skill set and experience, but is able to kind of complement the services that the outreach team provides. Okay, so it was clear that the Snug sites could really benefit from having a social worker, having case management, being able to work with their clients and high-risk participants in a way that kind of moves beyond just doing complex mediations. And there was a clear need. You know, we had outreach workers who would come and say, this person has mental health issues and I don't know what to do. I'm not trained to handle this. They would come and say that they're, you know, looking for a job. So those are things that the social worker and the case manager can assist with. We wanted to be able to provide comprehensive services to the Snug participants. So being able to add the social work mental health piece as well as the case management piece is really important to providing those comprehensive services. So in 2019, DCJS, working with the Office of Victim Services, was able to secure funding to start the social work case management section of Snug. All right, so just some general goals of the Snug Social Work Initiative. So we want to work with victims of crime, people in the community who are affected by gun violence. So every time there's a victim of gun violence, it affects not just that person, it affects their family, it affects their friends, it can affect everybody in their class at school. And the idea was that the Snug social work case management team could start working with some of those people who are being affected outside of the high-risk group. We also, as the Snug social work team, do work with Snug program participants, and that looks different. It might be meeting with an outreach worker and case conferencing different aspects of what's going on with their caseload of participants, and the social work and case manager giving them feedback. We do have some program participants who will come in for therapy sessions with the Snug social worker. That's pretty rare, but that mental health case management piece is available to the program participants as well. As you can imagine, the Snug outreach team is really exposed to a lot of trauma every day. I mean, these are people who are also have had similar experiences to the program participants that they're working with, and a lot have really complicated historical trauma, and the trauma that they're exposed to every day. Along with that, it's, you know, they need a lot of support, and the social worker is there and present and meant to provide at least some layer of support to the Snug outreach team. The other piece of this is really solidifying that connection between the trauma centers and Snug sites, which I will talk about in a minute. Okay, so one of the reasons that Snug is so effective and so important is because they are able to reach a population that most service providers have difficulty reaching. So especially young men of color, our systems are not set up to provide services, whether it's mental health, whether it's case management, to this population. And the outreach team has a particular skill set or ability to connect with these young men who are often underserved and develop that relationship. So once the outreach team is able to engage with their high-risk participants, they develop a relationship with them that would be very difficult for most service providers to do. And then they can start connecting them to different services once that trust has been built. So I think this idea of how do we engage this high-risk Snug population, but then also work to connect them to other services, kind of leveraging the relationship that the outreach worker has with the participant. So there are a lot of reasons that young men of color, especially with victim services, often do not get the same kind of treatment that other victims do. We have issues around relationships with law enforcement, lack of knowledge about support services, negative experiences with social services, and the Office of Victim Services itself was not set up to help this population. And they're obviously moving forward and trying to accommodate some of the needs of this population. They are funding the Snug Social Work Case Management Program. But other than Snug, there are no victim service programs that are specifically targeting young men of color, and especially victims of community violence or gun violence. Most Office of Victim Services programs are focused on working with victims of domestic violence, victims of sexual assault, child abuse. So we have a lot of programs in place to help these particular groups. And we have service providers who are trained for years and years and years about how to best work with these populations. So survivors of sexual assault or domestic violence. And they're really this doesn't exist for victims of community violence, gun violence. So we are, continuing to learn and build this and figure out what is necessary to best support the victims that we're working with. Trying to change this. Oh, okay. So this kind of goes back to what I was getting at earlier in terms of working with the Snug participant, whether it's a victim of gun violence or just somebody who's at high risk for being involved in gun violence. The social work case management piece is meant to be complementary to the outreach team and the services that the outreach team is providing. So the outreach team really focuses on knowledge of the community, gang crew activity. They have, like I mentioned, the ability to engage and build relationships with a high-risk population. And they have personal experience that enhances the ability to connect to participants. And then we have the social work side of things with the ability to navigate social services, provide trauma-informed treatment and practices, and resources and tools, with the education to support the outreach team. So we're really coming at this problem from different angles and trying to address all of the issues that arise with gun violence and working with people who are at high risk. So in terms of supporting the Snug team, The outreach team, like I mentioned, is exposed to a huge amount of trauma every single day, and really benefit from having the social worker able to work with each of them individually and as a group. We had a really horrible event in 2018. One of our outreach workers in Albany was shot and killed while trying to break up a fight. And I think this was one of the catalysts for getting the social work case management program, because we just saw how devastating that was to not only the Albany Snug team, but really every other Snug team across the state. We had every Snug team went to the funeral, and it just, you know, it really hit home. And so we have had other people shot and stabbed and involved in assaults while they're trying to break up fights. So this is really, there's a lot going on here in terms of trauma exposure and the risk that the outreach workers are putting themselves in order to work with their participants. So the social worker is able to meet with the team. They do a lot of, they join the briefing meetings every day with the team. They're able to help the team process things that are going on. So if there was recently a shooting that's really affected one of the outreach workers, they're able to talk through that, help support the team, help the team support each other, and focus on that trauma piece as, you know, when we're looking at different incidents that are happening in the community. They are also able to help the social worker is able to help the outreach team work with their participants. So we do case conferencing where the outreach worker will go through their caseload of high-risk participants, and the social worker will give feedback and, you know, help them look at different behaviors in a way that you know, with trauma kind of at the center of that, and able to inform, you know, how that outreach worker might go about addressing certain needs of that client or participant. All right, so getting a little bit into the hospital piece here. So I worked for 5 years at Jacoby Medical Center, and I responded to all the gun violence victims and families that came in there. And I was managing the Snug team that was based in the hospital. And we saw how important it was to have access to victims immediately after they'd been shot. Not just the victims, you know, the victim's family, the victim's friends. The hospital is often a place where people are congregating, and there is a lot of, you know, as you can imagine, just emotions are running high. So being able to have access to patients right after they've been victims of gun violence and their family goes a long way. It's usually the best moment to engage someone to start thinking about change in their lives and how they can make change and why it's important, and then developing that relationship with them while they're in this very vulnerable state extends to once they're discharged from the hospital, the social worker and the outreach team can continue to work with that person. It's also where you can engage family and friends who are most likely to be involved in some kind of retaliation, and the hospital is definitely a you know, the best location to do that right after an incident happens. We have the Jacoby Medical Center Snug team that's based in the hospital. We also now have the ECMC Snug team based in Buffalo. So ECMC is the trauma center in Buffalo, and the Snug team has recently been moved there. So we have 2 fully hospital-based programs. We have Snug social workers who have been hired at Albany Medical Center and Syracuse upstate. And those social workers are able to connect the victims of violence to the outreach team. That's, we hired them and put them in place to be that liaison between the hospital and the Snug outreach team. And we found that, even though it would be better to have them fully connected to the hospital, it's a really strong model. And, I got an email yesterday, a few days ago, about from the director of social work at Albany Med, who was just, was so grateful that they had the Snug team over the weekend to help them, because they'd had 7 shootings. It was in the evening hours. They had one social worker who covers the entire emergency room, and she's trying to run around helping 7 different families and organize, what's going on. And the Snug team showed up, the outreach workers, the social worker, and was really able to support the work that was happening in the hospital. And that didn't happen overnight. There's a relationship building piece to this. The hospitals, when they first learned about Snug, some have been skeptical about it, some don't really understand why, the value, but incidents like what I just described at Albany Med really have gotten hospitals fully, 100% on board with Snug. During periods of COVID, Albany Med was not allowing any visitors to the hospital, but they were allowing Snug. So it's been a really strong connection, and I think it's great for the outreach team and social worker to have access to the patient, but it's also great for the hospital to have this service being provided. All right, so one thing I want to mention as well is that Snug is a public health approach to gun violence prevention, and the connection between the hospital and Snug just makes sense in that way, that we are working with the hospital team who is healing the patient, but then we're continuing to work with them to prevent further violence from happening. And it's a system that needs to be connected and in partnership. Okay, so I think that's my last slide here. And Jeff and I wanted to answer any questions that people might have, clarify anything. So I'm going to stop sharing now and open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Erica and Jeffrey, for the information around Snug. I'm somewhat familiar, just only my own interactions here, living in Yonkers, being familiar with the Snug program here. So I appreciated this level of information, and as well as answering the question that I was wondering about what Snug stood for. So you've definitely, I appreciate that point of information. Questions, thoughts, reactions folks have? Judge Mendelson.
Hello. As someone who was actually born at Jacobi Hospital, where you are doing a great deal of remarkable work, I just wanted to thank you for your commitment to doing very, very difficult, traumatic work that is so necessary and more necessary than ever. Looking at these, connecting with the hospitals and the idea of looking at these very difficult, thorny issues as a public health measure and a community health measure is critically important. I just want to offer my gratitude to you and your team who are doing life-changing, life-impacting, but soul-draining work every day. So thank you.
Thank you.
Judge. one of the things I appreciate, that I look forward to as we continue hearing about the work that Snug is doing and the ways in which you all are being attentive to how you are expanding the areas of focus of your approach, right? So being cognizant of, of the harm and repair that needs to exist, and being able to have a social work model built into your approach, I think is a testament to a recognition that this is a complicated endeavor of not just of finding a different route for youth, but also a matter of how do we also be intentional in providing repair for different layers of hurt and harm that have transpired. So I appreciate you all kind of being cognizant of that. But it spurred my thinking around, particularly as a JAG, as we think forward in relation to some of the strategic plan elements, is, taking that sort of that learning point that you all had, and as a reference point in considering the complicated nature of trying to do continuous reform work. So, so I know you all gave a great deal of detail around sort of how it came about in terms of adding this social work element to it, but I'm seeing the significance of it, not just existing, but what may be the ways in which it will need to expand over time to address, particularly going back to your early slides around the goals and vision of your Snug program. So thank you.
Thank you.
I think I just wanted to mention that none of this would be even taking place if it weren't for Mike Green supporting this program and really pushing it at all levels, all the way through this endeavor here. And then bringing on Elizabeth Cronin and OVS, and really having her finance the social work side of things. It's been a great marriage, and we look forward to continued success in that arena.
Thank you, Jeff, but it truly has been a partnership, and Damon and Jeff and Erica and Elizabeth and Mike Wood and everyone at the grant shop and so many more. It's everyone has contributed, and it's been a great partnership.
Wonderful. Well, if there aren't any questions or comments from other JAG members, I want to thank you both for sharing some really rich information regarding the Snug Street Outreach Program. Now we're going to turn it over to our JJ Data folks, who are going to provide some really rich information regarding the state of juvenile justice data patterns.
Yes.
Thank you. This is, sorry, go ahead, Tom.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say Lee Bates and Becky Coleman, who pulled together a great presentation that they're about to share with us. Go ahead, Lee.
Thank you, Tom. I was going to say this is probably not as compelling as Jeff and Erica's presentation on Snug, but I promise there are some very interesting data nuggets here that we'll share with you. Let me pull my PowerPoint up. And, okay. So thank you again for having us. My name is Lee Bates. I'm heading up the research shop here at DCJS, and I'm joined by Becky Coleman today, who's the head of the research office in OCFS. Many of you may have seen the presentation that Becky gave with Terry Salo last year, looking at trends in youth justice through 2019. This year, we'll update through 2020, which will show the first year of full implementation of Raise the Age. So as we go through today, we're going to move through the JD case processing before and after Raise the Age. We'll also take a look at the impact of COVID on case activity, which was pretty substantial. And we'll take a look at arrests and case processing for JOs and AOs. Just to reorient everybody to the system as it looked in 2020, this is what was in place after implementation of Raise the Age. So as mentioned, it was the first full year of implementation. The JOs and AOs, or the 16-year-old AOs, or 16 and 17-year-olds arrested for felony offenses, were all handled through the youth part during this time frame. In criminal court, the cases could either remain in criminal court in youth part or be removed to family court or probation intake, where they would become JDs. And the JDs would be handled by the probation and family court, where cases would result in either findings or no findings. Looking briefly here at trends, the 10-year trends, we wanted to share some of what was happening, you know, at an annual level with the different case processing points for youth justice. We see big declines in the JD detention admissions, with a 73% decrease over time from 2011 through 2020. And we also see major declines in probation intake cases opened. There's an increase in 2019 that you can see, which was showing the implementation of Raise the Age, and then declines sort of across the board in 2020 with COVID, and we'll take a closer look at that later on as well. Overall, the number of youth coming into the system has declined from 50% for intake cases open to 73% for detention admissions, and we'll look again more closely at these in the most recent time periods.
Okay, so in the next series of slides, we're going to take a closer look at each of the system points that Lee was just presenting on, and really focus in on how processing patterns have changed since the implementation of Raise the Age. You're going to see that the next series of slides, the deck follows a similar format. So for each system point, we're going to give you breakouts for New York City and rest of state separately. And there's two visuals on each slide that give you a sense of both the overall system volume at that point in time and also what we're seeing in terms of racial and ethnic differences in system contact. All of the data points that we're going to be presenting include the full JD youth population. So we're including both non-RTA and RTA youth. And we're showing you that time span from 2017, which was pre-Raise the Age, through to 2020, which, as Lee just mentioned, was the first calendar year during which all the Raise the Age provisions were in full effect. So this first slide shows you New York City JD detention admissions. If you look at the line graph that's on the right side of the slide, you'll see that despite some of the fears that were out there that adding 16 and 17-year-olds to the system was going to be overwhelming, New York City detention admissions have continued to decline over the course of Raise the Age implementation. In 2017, when delinquency status was restricted to youth who were 15 or younger at the time of their alleged offense, we had 1,842 delinquency-related admissions citywide in New York City. By 2020, the annual admission number for JDs, which at this point includes youth 17 and younger, right, had dropped by over 1,000 cases, or about 58%, to just 776. So as Lee mentioned, later in the presentation, we do have a series of slides that dive more deeply into data during the COVID period. But I think what's nice about this trend that you're seeing here for New York City is that the drops have been really consistent and seem to be part of a steady 4-year downward trend and not just unique to whatever's been happening in 2020. From a race ethnicity perspective, the decline in admissions was observed for our Black, Hispanic, and white youth, with the largest declines among the Hispanic and Black youth, which is really great news, in that it means that fewer youth are being detained each year, and that all of our groups have been seeing some benefit in terms of the raw numbers of youth that are being impacted by detention. However, if you switch your attention now to the bar chart on the left side of the slide, you're going to see that disproportionate contact was an issue prior to Raise the Age, and it has remained an issue in 2020. The leftmost bar on the graph shows you recent population data for New York City for youths age 7 to 17, so sort of in our juvenile delinquency range here, with the percentage of whites captured in dark blue, blacks in orange, Hispanics in gray, and sort of that golden color for other. As you can see in the population bar, just under a quarter of New York City's youth population is Black. But if you start moving your eye over towards the right and look at the portion of orange shown in each of the next two bars, you're going to see a substantial increase in the percentage of Blacks who are touching detention. Black youth accounted for 62% of detention admissions in 2017 and 65% in 2020. In contrast, our white youth are grossly underrepresented at both time points. They make up 27% of the population in New York City and less than 4% of the detention admissions. Just want to pause there and kind of let that sink in. It's going to be a familiar pattern, unfortunately, that we're going to be seeing across our slides. Like whites, our Hispanic youth are slightly underrepresented compared to their presence in the general population. And we see in New York City, and we see this underrepresentation has actually grown over time. So from 36% to 28%. Lee, if you can move to the next slide. When we take a closer look at where youth are admitted once they're detained, we see that nearly 2/3 of New York City detention admissions are going to secure facilities, with another 8% in mixed, meaning that they moved or spent time in both non-secure and secure settings during the course of their stay. And we can also see here that our Hispanic youth make up a larger portion of the secure admissions than they do for the non-secure. So again, those race and ethnicity differences also appearing across some of our setting types. We can move to the next slide. We're going to take a look at rest of state, where we'll see the story is slightly different. Unlike New York City, rest of state did not see that same continued shrinkage in detention admissions across this 4-year period. The overall number of detention admissions started to decrease as we went from 17 to 2018, but then went to increase again between 18 and 19 with the implementation of phase 1 of Raise the Age. And then we hit 2020 and COVID, and we see that those annual numbers go down again. So by the end of 2020, our total number of admissions was about 450 fewer than we had been seeing in 2017. In terms of race and ethnicity, again, like in New York City, we see that Black youth make up the largest proportion of youth who are being admitted to detention. While only 11% of the rest of state youth population is Black, we see around 50% of detention admissions involve our Black youth. Here, white youth make up the second largest detained group, but again, they are grossly underrepresented relative to their presence in the population. Over 2/3 of rest of state youth are white, and only about a quarter of detention admissions are involving white youth each year. And finally, while Hispanic youth were slightly underrepresented in New York City detention centers, as we saw a moment ago, they are slightly overrepresented in New York State. And this disparity has increased between 2017 and 2020. So going from 17 to 20% versus the 16% in the population. If we go to the next slide.
Sorry, I'm trying to. Let me try again.
It's okay. It's an interesting one to look at.
There we go.
Okay. Again, when you're looking at where youth are admitted once they are detained, we see that non-secure admissions make up 35% of all the JD detention admissions in rest of state, which is just slightly higher than the 29% that we were seeing in New York City. We see that white youth are placed in non-secure settings more often than secure settings, and that the opposite is true for our Black and Hispanic youth, who are more likely to be admitted to secure.
And Looking at probation intakes then, these will be similar to the charts and graphs that Becky was just showing, where we're looking at the population on the left bar, and then looking at the distribution, the racial and ethnic distribution, in this case for New York City JD probation intakes. Here we see there's not a big change in the distribution by race in New York City between 2017 and 2020. In 2017, Black youth were about 24% of the population and 60% of intakes. White youth were 27% of the population and 4% of intakes, and Hispanic youth were 36% of the population and 30% of intakes. This didn't change very much in 2020, where the Black youth were still 61% of intakes, Hispanic youth made up 30%, and white youth were 5% of intakes. We can see in the line chart over on the right that the volume did increase pretty significantly in 2019 for Black and Hispanic youth. The volume was much higher with the implementation of phase 2 for ACH, starting during that time frame, but the proportions were consistent across those years. And has come down again in 2020, again with COVID. Some of that volume has come down a little bit. Looking at intake outcomes by race, in New York City, there are many fewer white youth overall compared to Black and Hispanic youth. The Black youth charged with felonies were least likely to be successfully adjusted, with white youth more likely, most likely at 33%. Among the misdemeanors, we see a similar pattern in New York City, though more cases are successfully adjusted overall than they are for felonies. Still, the white and Hispanic youth are showing 48% of intakes being successfully adjusted, while Black youth have lower adjustment rates at 39%, and higher rates of being referred to the presentment agency at 61%, compared to 52% for white and Hispanic youth. In rest of state, we also are seeing relatively little change in the racial and ethnic distribution over time, with similar distributions across race and ethnicity in 2017 and 2020. And I just lost the screen here. So Karen, I think I'm going to try to steal this back from you.
Let's see here.
There we go. Okay, so this is back up. We're seeing, again, in 2019, some big increases in the number of Black youth, and the proportion was also higher in 2019. And there were reductions again in 2020 where the proportion of Black, white, Hispanic youth were largely back to pre-raised age levels. Looking at intake outcomes, we see that similar to New York City, the white youth are most likely to have their cases successfully adjusted. Among those charged with felonies at 43%. However, here Hispanic youth were less likely than Black youth to have their cases adjusted. 30% of Hispanic youth charged with felonies had their intakes successfully adjusted compared to 34% of Black youth. And among misdemeanors, again, more cases overall are successfully adjusted, and the rates are highest for the white and Hispanic youth, which have 55% of intakes successfully adjusted compared to 45% for Black youth. Looking next at delinquency petitions filed, as a reminder, the cases are referred to the presentment agency and are reviewed by the county presentment agency upstate or the New York City Law Department in New York City, which will determine if a petition will be filed. In rest of state, we find that most of the cases referred to petition actually have a petition filed. In New York City, however, it's only about a third of cases referred that do actually have a petition filed. So this explains in part a little bit of why the New York City petitions filed is so much lower than the number that are actually referred to petition. Here again in New York City, looking at 2020 compared to 2017, we see that the racial and ethnic distribution in 2020 is pretty different from what it was before race age was implemented. There were about 40 fewer petitions filed overall in 2020, looking at 873 petitions filed compared to 1,452 filed in 2017. On the right side here, we can see that the declines were highest for, were largest for white and Hispanic youth, though again, there are relatively few white youth who are in this system, in this part of the system in New York City. Second, we see that the proportion of petitions that are for Black youth has increased over time from 59% of petitions in 2017 being for Black youth compared to 66% in 2020. Meanwhile, the proportion of petitions that were for Hispanic and white youth continues to decrease over time, with 32% of Hispanic youth, 32% of petitions in 2017 being for Hispanic youth compared to 25% in 2020. So the racial and ethnic distribution is looking different in 2020. In New York City, looking at petition outcomes, again, there are very few white youth with petitions disposed. And that was 17 white youth in New York City had their petitions disposed in 2020. Among Black and Hispanic youth, the outcomes were most likely to be an other favorable disposition or probation, with 28% of Black youth being ordered to probation and 34% of Hispanic youth. Among the misdemeanors, we see that outcomes for Black and Hispanic youth were also most likely to be other favorable dispositions and ACDs, or adjournments in contemplation of dismissal. In rest of state, the change wasn't quite as big, but it did follow a similar pattern with proportionally more Black youth in 2020 and fewer white and Hispanic youth among the petitions filed. The volume overall was similar to 2017 levels at 3353 in 2017 compared to 3553 in 2020. And again, that was likely owing to COVID and fewer petitions being filed. And looking at petition outcomes by race in 2020, we're seeing that the different groups had similar placement rates ranging from 12% among Hispanic youth being placed, 13% of white youth, and 14% of Black youth. The Black youth were less likely to have a term of supervision imposed, and with Hispanic youth were more likely to have an other favorable disposition for felony offenses. And among misdemeanors, all youth were most likely to have ACDs ordered or other favorable outcomes, with Black youth most likely to have these case outcomes.
Okay, so the next 4 slides are going to drill down into the recent admissions to out-of-home placement settings, and these numbers are going to include JD youth who are placed into what we're referring to as community-based residential programs, which is really the term we're using here to describe youth who are placed into the care and custody of a local social service district, as well as youth who are placed into OCFS custody but are admitted into one of those more foster care settings. So it's those two groups combined. And then a separate breakout we'll also be putting up for the youth who are placed into OCFS custody and admitted to our state-run facilities. They're slightly different from the petition data that Lee just presented because these admission numbers are capturing all of our youth who are coming into residential care. So that includes youth who are coming in sort of for the first time off of an initial disposition of their JD case, as well as those who may enter later in the course of their case, say as due to a probation violation or maybe a request for modification if they're moving into an OCFS facility. So in New York City, we see the overall placement admission numbers are down substantially from 2017, dropping from 163 to 68 in 2020. The admissions dropped steadily for Hispanic youth and are pretty much just non-existent, right? We've bottomed out there. We're not placing any white youth in New York City. For our Black youth, admission numbers are lower than they were in 2017, but we do see that increase, right, when we move across raise the age. So they went up from 2018 to 2019. They're down a little bit in 2020. Again, hard to know how much of that might be due to COVID. As we see in the other system points, the Black youth made up our largest proportion of youth admitted, and they are represented at a percentage that is almost triple that of their presence in the general population. So 24% versus 75% in New York City. And this disparity has actually increased following Raise the Age when we're looking at the 2020 numbers. Next slide, Lee. There's not as much to be gained here under the Close to Home program in New York City. All New York City JDs are admitted to a Close to Home program run by New York City. So you'll see there's 0 OCFS facility admissions, but you can see the breakout of the 68 admissions by race and ethnicity again there. We can move on to the next slide. We'll take a look at rest of state. Like New York City, we see admission numbers in rest of state continued on a downward trend, dropping from 639 in 2017 to just 446 in 2020. Again, all three race ethnicity groups saw declines in terms of raw numbers, and we see that the gains in those declines were greatest for our Black youth at a decline of 40%. Again, how much of it is reflective of COVID is hard to say, as admission numbers for our Black and white youth did start to climb between 2018 and 19, but then dropped again in 2020. So these are some of those patterns that we'll be watching to see what happens as our 2021 data comes in. Again, if you're switching to look at the left side of your graph, disparities remain a substantial issue, with our Black youth grossly overrepresented in their placement settings relative to their presence in the youth population, but with a slight improvement since 2017. So hopefully some good news there, and maybe a pattern that will continue. Conversely, for our Hispanic youth, while the raw numbers are down, the disproportionality has been creeping up, with Hispanics accounting for only 16% of the youth population, but 21% of the placement admissions in 2020. So if we can go to the next slide. For rest of state, we see that most placement admissions are to community-based residential programs, with only about a third entering OCFS facilities. Whites are slightly less likely to be admitted to an OCFS facility, and while our Black and Hispanic youth are slightly more likely. So I'll pause there. The next set of slides is what we've been alluding to for a while here. We thought we'd provide a quick jump into some of what we've seen during the COVID period and try to understand. Well, since trying to understand how Raise the Age has impacted juvenile justice is really complicated by the fact that the pandemic hit shortly after full Raise the Age implementation, and pretty much, as the slides we just went through show, kind of upended every system point in the continuum. But if we can move to the next slide, this takes a look at JD detention admissions broken out now by quarter instead of year, and going from 2019 to 2021. You can see, to try and orient you in time, we've put some lines there to show you where full Raise the Age implementation occurred, as well as that lovely date in mid-March of 2020 when most of the world got sent home. And you will see between that Q1 and Q2, there is in 2020, there's just a real substantial drop in our detention admissions. It starts to pick back up again in later quarters, but it's still not coming back up to the levels that we were seeing, prior to COVID, and sort of in that in between the two bars, where Raise the Age had been fully implemented, but the world hadn't shut down yet. If you go to the next slide, This is showing you that same data for New York City admissions by race. You can see the pattern seems to be pretty comparable across the different race and ethnicity groups in terms of what's happening with them post-COVID. The pattern sort of maintains the same and the levels. If we look at the next one, which focuses on rest of state, we see that, again, numbers are still lower in recent quarters than we saw immediately before COVID, but they have started to climb back up from that initial drop.
And with intakes open, looking at the same time period and the same quarters, we're seeing similar trends here where there were increases toward the end of 2019, but then these similar drops in 2020, especially Q2, coinciding with COVID. In Q3 of 2020, New York City continued the decline, and throughout 2020 and into 2021 have been fluctuating around about 1,000 intakes per quarter in New York City. In rest of state in Q3, intakes started to bounce back, started to come back up, but have declined since then and have also converged around 1,000 intakes per quarter, at least in Q1 of 2021. Looking at petitions filed, we see the same trend over time here, where there was a slight uptick looking at Q4 of 2019, but that really precipitous drop in Q2 of 2020, especially as the courts were closing and only the most serious cases were moving through. They came back up in Q3 of 2020 and have generally stabilized since then, especially looking at Q4 and then early this year, looking at Q1 of 21.
Switching back over to the placement side of things, again, this is really just recapping what you saw on the earlier slides. We only have the annual data here. We're still down from where we were, several years ago, but again, we see that drop with the start of COVID. I think it's really the next slide that paints a slightly more interesting picture, which is taking a look at rest of state, where there are options, again, and where our youth can be admitted to. And here we see that the decline has largely been driven by a drop in our community residential admissions. They went from 425 in 2019 down to 296 in 2020 with the onset of COVID, and virtually no change in our OCFS facility admissions. So just a drop of 3 youth.
And next we'll turn to the JO arrests and then later on the adolescent offenders. Looking at JO arrests over time, this is the 10-year trend showing 2011 through 2020. Here we see that the arrests for JOs were down 56% in New York City, from 547 to 243 in 2020. And we're also down 48% in rest of state. And for rest of state, this 98 was a 10-year low for both regions, 10-year low for the JO arrests. Looking at the specific offenses that JOs are being arrested for, we find here that robbery first accounts for most of the offenses in New York City and upstate. And these are also taken directly from data that's posted on our website if folks want to take a closer look at that. Looking at court case outcomes for JOs, we see that 73% of cases among the white youth were removed to family court. And this is compared to 54% of cases among Black youth and 56% of cases among Hispanic youth. Again, pointing out that there are very few cases among white youth at this point. There are only 15 cases here. But the Black and Hispanic youth were more likely to have outcomes in youth part, with 33% of cases among Black youth receiving a felony conviction or adjudication, and 31% among Hispanic youth.
Okay, and so shifting back to take a look at the admission side of things, I think what's really impressive here, if you look at that top table, is there's been an extreme drop in New York City over the past 5 years in terms of admissions to OCFS facilities for our JOs, dropping from 47 down to just 12, so a 74% decline. And just not seeing that same pattern in rest of state, right? The numbers increased a little bit between 2016 and 2020. They were sort of going upward, fluctuating a little bit, and then back down to 17 at 2020. So showing no sort of net change there. Despite the fact, if you go back to that trend line that Lee was putting up just a few moments ago, that we're seeing the arrests are going down in rest of state. Oh, sorry, Lee, I didn't mean to make you jump back. Just
Thought it was
trying
closer.
to put sorry, just putting that into context though, right? Like we're seeing those declines, and as you were saying, an all-time low in the JO arrests, but really in rest of state, we haven't seen as much difference in the kids who are coming into our facilities on JOs. If you look at the bottom table on the graph, the racial and ethnic disparities, they exist here just as they did when we were looking at the juvenile justice and delinquency side, with almost all of our recent admits being Black and Hispanic youth in both New York City and rest of state in this instance.
And finally, we'll turn over to the 16 and 17-year-old arrests and also the adolescent offender case processing, which of course are happening in youth part. Looking at the felony arrests of 16 and 17-year-olds, again, over the 10-year time period, we're seeing a 65% decrease overall statewide, with a 64% decline in New York City and 66% in rest of state. And felony arrests in rest of state were at the 10-year low. Again, for both of them. I don't know why I keep saying that. Looking at the felony firearm arrests, this is, you know, we've been hearing about the increases in firearm arrests and in shootings statewide and also nationwide. And so we wanted to take a closer look at this among 16 and 17-year-olds. Here, although felony firearm arrests have declined 32% since 2011, we do see that increase in New York City since 2018 and the very recent increase in the rest of the state between 2019 and 2020. In rest of state, the firearm arrests were also down, but have increased and are the highest that they've been since 2013. So these arrests in particular have come up recently. Looking at arrest offenses for the AOs in New York City, looking at the Black youth, there are about 1,400 of the 2,200 total AO arrests, or about 66%, were among Black youth in New York City, and Hispanic youth accounted for the other 29%. AO arrests in New York City were most likely to be for robbery, assault, larceny, and then the firearms and weapons offenses. In the rest of the state, the AO arrests were about 50% among the Black youth, 30% white youth, and 13% Hispanic youth. And here we see that the offenses themselves were more broadly distributed. Looking at court case outcomes, what's striking in New York City is that the vast majority of cases are removed to family court or probation intake, really across all of the different racial and ethnic categories. Overall, 94% of cases were removed to probation or family court intake, and about 6% have outcomes in youth part, with 3% of cases resulting in conviction or adjudication. In rest of state as well, the majority of cases are removed to family court or probation intake, although proportionally fewer here are removed to family court or intake. About 82% of cases among Black youth are removed, 90% of cases among Hispanic youth, and 92% of cases among white youth. About 18% of Black youth had their cases resolved in youth part, with 11% resulting in a conviction or adjudication, and that's compared to 8% among Hispanic youth and 6% among white youth. Among the sentences imposed, looking down here at the bottom block, about 65% of white youth have a sentence of probation, and then 35% have a term of confinement, whether that's for a year or more or confinement and probation split. Fewer Black youth have probation sentences, 43%, and are more likely to have confinement ordered, and Hispanic youth are even less likely to have an order to probation and are more likely to have an order of confinement.
Okay, and so since Raise the Age has been in place and in 2020, our adolescent offenders essentially have two options for confinement, either in our specialized secure detention centers, where they can be housed post-sentencing if that sentence is less than a year, or in an OCFS secure facility, which as of 2020 can serve both those youth with a sentence under 1 year, if that was ordered by the judge, or if they are less than 18 and have that longer year or more sentence that would have previously have gone to DOCS. Those are now OCFS secure admissions. You can see that overall the admissions numbers are low in both settings. We do see slightly more placements in rest of state than New York City. And again, most of the youth being admitted are Black and Hispanic youth. And I think that is our final data slide. We've shown you all so many numbers today. So if anyone is still awake and has questions, we are happy to entertain them.
Thank you both for sharing this set of data analysis of the different sort of touch points and also the differentials in terms of the different youth groups. It's really helpful. In addition, I really appreciate the ongoing, attention to, looking at it by the cut of New York City and rest of state, and as well as looking at it by race ethnicity. So I just want to start with the thank you. I'm still sitting with the continuous sort of recognition that there's, as we see this sort of interesting sort of downturns at the different junctures, right? The junctures around Raise the Age and as well as COVID. I'm also kind of sitting with and trying to make sense of the nature of the persisting disparities that exist at different junctures, and in my head trying to sort of make sense of, well, what do we know about sort of what's transpiring at those different junctures, and how does the JAG, especially since knowing that our next conversation is going to be around our strategic plan, how do we weigh in and sort of in capacities that we can to make sense of that sort of ongoing disparity.
If I can just respond to, on the DCJS side, with the petitions in particular, which was where we saw a pretty big increase in disparity among family court petitions. My sense is that with COVID and with the closure of courts and a very specific set of cases that are moving through the courts, that is, I would assume associated with some of that disparity. And as the courts catch up and all of those cases come through, it's possible, I don't know, I mean, it remains to be seen, but possible that some of that disparity will at the very least go back to what it was, before COVID. So I would echo what Becky said earlier, that it will be, I think, really interesting to see what happens with the trends in 2021 and continue to monitor the different points and the breakout, the sort of demographic, racial and ethnic distributions across those points.
Hi, I'm Euphemia, and most of the information is really nothing new, where we see the disparity in the numbers of people of color overrepresented in the system, and our brown, brothers and sisters also overrepresented. And the message that is being conveyed to me is that there's still a lot of work that has to be done with the gatekeepers. And the gatekeepers are the police who are interacting with these young people and making the determination of whether or not they're going to arrest them and have them go through the front door of the system. And then the second piece of it is those who are sitting on the bench. A concern that I have are the corporate counsel and those attorneys who are supposed to be representing our young people. Personal experience has shown me that those that we're entrusting with the lives of our young people when they go through that door are not really in the best interest of our children. That many of them encourage our young children to take plea deals when they may not have committed an act that they're accused of committing. Once again, I'm speaking from personal experience and from the experience of parents that over the years I've had a chance to work with. And for me, it goes back to corporate counsel, those attorneys who are supposed to be representing our children's best interest, and seeing how many of them have actually have children that they were supposed to be representing that were found guilty. You know, I would be interested in knowing how many of them have actually been successful in presenting cases, as opposed to, okay, just go ahead, take the plea, you get a lesser charge, or won't be as bad as if you go any further. Because unfortunately, it appears that they really don't care. That many of these young people are going before judges with court-appointed attorneys that want to go on to the next case. And for me, it goes back to how much diversity training is really being done on these different levels. And for people to really check themselves on their biases. Because just because someone wears a title of police officer, of attorney, of judge, does not mean that their personal biases are not standing right there with them. You know, I was telling my sister the other day, it's very funny when I see cases, you know, not cases, but crimes on television, I never see any white people. I never see any white people. I see Black people. And I'm just going to call it the way I see it when I watch the news. What's wrong with that picture? Because I know there's crimes being committed by other than Blacks. But once again, it goes back into the psychological impact of the public about a certain group of people because of the image always displayed, whether it's in the news, whether it's in the movies, whether it's in music. And it's not really an accurate portrayal of people of color, or Black people. I really don't like to say Black people because people are not Black. But people from the formerly physically enslaved who are now mentally enslaved people. I'll put it that way, right? And when I look at it, it's very disheartening because I know that there are so many young people who have been railroaded by the people that they're entrusting with their lives in front of the court system. So I don't know what kind of work can be done on the other side of it, or what kind of data can be collected about, you know, certain courthouses, about certain attorneys, about whoever are the people making the decisions, even the police officers. You know, how many arrests are they making with other than these other groups of people that are showing up more in the system than their Caucasian counterparts? That's just my questions and my heart. And I say that because it doesn't only show up in juvenile justice, but it also shows up in foster care. You know, my daughter, because of these very situations where, you know, my children, my sons were through the juvenile justice system and the adult system. I still have a son who's incarcerated. One just got out in December. And she decided she was going to be an attorney to help young children like her brothers were, who were always encouraged to take a plea deal when they said they didn't commit a crime. But, you know, she works for legal aid now. And just hearing how the representatives from ACS come in and they're not prepared to really advocate for the family, because she's an attorney for the children, and just so many cases that come before that they don't even have any understanding of what the family they're representing is, who the family they're representing is, for one, or what the situation is. So they have to keep coming back and going back to court because they don't have their act together, right? So I'm wondering, like, just, and when I look at all these systems that's supposed to be in place to help, they're doing more harm, you know, but yet and still the finger's still being pointed at the parent or caregivers, when it's really the whole community that needs to be explored, you know, from the different vantage points. And I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Can I there were many stuff that were said there, but as we were going through the data, you know, it's so great to see that that the chart is showing that it's going down. What is a concern to me is that for who is it going down to? We're still incarcerating a higher rate. And you know, I agree with the females, but with the people are just people, right? We have these labels. But I'm just gonna say it so people can stay on page with me, right? If we look at the rates for our Black community, for our Hispanic community, right? Like it's crazy to see to me that some charts have 0 to 5, 8% of white people. We are creating solutions, but those solutions are not actually working. That's what it's saying to me, right? So that is a huge concern. And I know that right now we're like all hands on deck trying to come up with solutions and new innovations to address this issues of race, but it's still, that is just saying that we have to do some serious work. That should be one of our main priorities. And I do wanted to say, actually, Euphemia, like I don't think I'm really open to what my experience has ever been. Maybe a couple of people have heard it, but you know, it really, I was one of those kids, Euphemia. You know, I got my first offense was petty larceny, $25. And I got sentenced to 18 months of probation. First offense, right? Because of that plea deal, because of that no support, no advocate, right? Like speaking on my behalf to support me, right? So, and this is so crazy that we keep saying the same story with different faces, and it's just so tiring and, you know, so enraging to keep having these conversations. So we have to do a lot better. And you know, there are many stuff there's so much that we can do, but definitely this data, it's showing us that we have to focus. Two priorities should be race.
And, you know, if I may say, you know, I think this is having this information kind of feed us, as particularly when we move in talking about a strategic plan, because I think in some ways what you both just highlighted is why we kind of structure the stuff that we have in strategic plan to focus in on those areas. Because I think this data is the patterns stay pretty consistent, which means that there becomes a narrative that gets constructed around it. And I like to believe that what we built in strategic plan is an opportunity to disrupt some of that, not just narrative, but also in some ways sort of the, I can't remember who used the language of sort of the gatekeeping points that are most pivotal, you know, to be informed and adjusted to ensure that there's equitable opportunities for our youth, who are still youth, right? And still need to experience the levels of humanization. I want to give us an opportunity to sort of, if there are any questions specific to the data for our two presenters, because I think what Euphemia and Michelle have highlighted for us is really, in some ways, sort of the direct connection to our strategic plan. of why we actually have it. So I wanted to sort of see if there are any questions around the data, because we're going to take this conversation right into the strategic plan. All right. I'm going to take that to mean that we're ready to go into the strategic plan. Right now that we've been armed in some ways with a lot of information from all of our partners. So thank you so much, Leah and Rebecca, for your presentation. Or Becky, I think somebody called you. I'm sorry.
You're welcome.
All right, Tom. So what we're going to do in terms of this strategic plan, we're going to do a quick sort of 5,000 view reminder of what we put in there. And I want us to carry sort of these points that Euphemia and Michelle sort of raised for us. Because one of the things we want to do is we want to prioritize these key goals. What do we want to target and focus on first as part of our set of efforts? And then we're going to talk a little bit about the grants working group, which is going to be a conduit, a tool for us to move this work forward using the set of means that are available to us. So Tom.
Thank you, Eddie, and thank you everybody for, first of all, the great presentations that we've heard today, and then really the members speaking up about the frustrations in trying to move this work forward, and in how we might be able to get that done. So as Eddie said, can people see that screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. As Eddie said, this is, I don't know where those curtains came from. They must have been on an old PowerPoint, so I'm sorry. But we're unveiling the strategic plan, I guess, once again. And we just wanted to do a brief overview before really getting into the conversation about, how are we going to actually do something about these things that everybody's talking about, based on all the information we received and the highlights that Euphemia and Michelle just brought up here. Just as a reminder, this strategic plan was jointly prepared by the Youth Justice Institute and the DCJS Office of Youth Justice. It covers the 3 years between January 1st, 2021 and December 31st, 2023. It is publicly available, so to the extent that JAG members and others are able to share it out, it's right there on our website. It was informed by many different things, interviews with JAG members and other key state and national stakeholders, a survey of juvenile justice specialists from across the country, the COVID-19 and Youth Forum the first one anyway, that helped feed into the plan, the retreat that we had last September over the course of a couple of days, and then a range of supporting documents. 12 major themes and actions came out of all of those interviews and conversations and background material. How do we sustain positive outcomes from pandemic-related changes? How can we better align efforts and services, support implementation, science, and translational efforts? I think, most importantly, that, addressing racial and ethnic disparities, that really came out across the board and included in every theme that we talked about, focusing on trauma, healing, and behavioral health, placing a little bit more of a focus on prevention, youth-centered services, partnering with schools, working with police and communities, and establishing better partnerships and relationships there. Training and certifying youth serving professionals. So when you talk about the gatekeepers, how do how do we train them to better be able to better respond on behalf of our youth? Focusing more on youth-centered service delivery, youth, family, and community partnerships, and then procedural justice at all system points. So those were the 12 themes and actions that were included in the plan. A vision and 3 goals were included as well. And the vision that came out of this process was that the New York State youth justice system operates with effective, safe, fair, and equitable practices that promote public safety, prevention, wellness, and healing, and maintain commitments to raise the age priorities and align with intersecting systems. 3 major goals. 1, really focusing on alignment to make sure that we're all on the same page in working across systems and levels of government. Focusing on some specific priorities that are coming from those 12 themes that we just talked about, and then better partnerships with youth, families, and communities across the system to really improve outcomes, create meaningful connections. And to implement the plan, the main piece of it on the funding side is to allocate the funding in a way that specifically addresses the vision, goals, and action steps in the plan. So what can we do concretely that gets to some of those issues that we've heard about today? And then disseminating the plan across the state and highlighting its purpose, making sure that we're including data analysis in the conversation on the quantitative side as well, because that's very important to do that. And then disseminating information across the system on best practices and what works, and that's where the Youth Justice Institute really comes in a big way as well. So that is really it. I didn't want to take up a lot of time in kind of going back through everything that we've talked about a lot over the course of the past year plus, but just wanted to give a brief reminder of how the plan came to be and what's in it, and to build a conversation from there. So I don't know if anybody has any comments, questions, or anything like that before we kind of get into, how are we going to make this work now? No.
No, yeah, I think, as we move forward, we know that we've identified as part of our working strategy, the grants working group as a conduit for moving forward what the JAG identifies as a priority, right? In terms of that live within these set of goals. So I'd like for us to get into a discussion around how do we want to approach deciding on the prioritization within these set of goals. And I'm wondering, would it be worthwhile to have the goals slide that you had, Tom, sitting up so that we can view it as a
Sure.
JAG? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one. Thoughts around sort of how do we want to approach this, right? In terms of meeting these set of goals that we've outlined for ourselves over the next 3 years. I think this is, we need to identify sort of how we want to prioritize. And I know within each goal, and you'll see there's some language in there around some of the action items that we identified that are particular, but given sort of the bodies of information that we gathered here today, and I want to say that one of the things that I anticipate us being able to do is that at every meeting we have an ongoing sort of repertoire of information that's constantly being provided for us, so that we can and we use it as a set of leveraging to look back again at our action items and how do we keep refining and moving them forward towards actual implementation throughout New York. So I want to get sort of folks' thoughts and, you know, how do we want to approach sort of moving these set of goals forward?
I just wanted to say that based on the data that we just viewed, which is just, I mean, it gets more and more just atrocious every time we look at it. And you know, I feel like the last time we looked at it, and I remember Sheila in particular just saying, okay, it's time, we gotta stop talking, it's time for action. And I don't, like, we have a lot of money, we have money to spend, we have to, I mean, we've been talking about the same thing for 20 years now, like, somehow we have to put our investments into interventions and you know, create a platform where we just say we can't tolerate this anymore. I mean, I mean, these goals are all great. It can be just infused. All of these goals can be infused, informed by, you know, our outrage about the disparities that we see in the system. And I personally would like to elevate that as sort of a top framing point of anything that we invest in.
So this is Sheila, everyone. So, you know, I've been on the JJAG for many, many years, you know, at this point, and I think always starting from a positive place. You know, I would just like to comment, I think the kinds of conversations that we're having today and the kind of vision and goals, the strategic plan, you know, just creating a space where Euphemia and Michelle and others can feel safe, you know, in expressing what this experience is like for it. It's come a long, long way, the JJAG has. And so I think we have to acknowledge the progress we've made in really, you know, using the full power of the JJAG and the, you know, representation of such amazing people and partners, and, you know, obviously the Youth Justice Institute. And I'll just say this past summer, and I know, you know, Mike Green was part of this, as was Nina and Damon. We were part of a variety of listening sessions across the state with real members of the community, not our typical partners, whether it's, you know, local departments of social services or the bigger not-for-profits, but it was really the term, you know, and even it's, I hate to say this, but it's like the hyper local, as they call it, right? You know, it's the faith communities, it's the God squads, you know, it's the folks, you know, doing sort of work on the street corners within communities, right, where, let's face it, most of our kids in the juvenile justice system are coming from. And I do think, and I'll own this at OCFS, you know, that in government, we're into Emily's point, you know, it's not so much a shortage of money, maybe it is in some places, but it's how do we really, you know, use government to create pathways for very community-driven, neighborhood-based interventions that are culturally relevant to that neighborhood block and that community. And, you know, we all admit we don't have a fully coordinated system of prevention, right, of those services and supports to very young people within their communities, led by people in their communities. And with all due respect to not-for-profits, they play a role, right? But sometimes the not-for-profits aren't even from their community. And we heard a lot of feedback across the state when we sat with these community members. And so I just say that to put that out there, that as the JJAG continues, right, and we make investments, maybe something we could collectively endeavor to is to think more carefully about how, in making investments, are we truly listening and responding to what young people and individuals, parents living in those communities really think will help them, because it's a very different conversation than it is when we at a state office, right, have a conversation about what we think. And it's sometimes, it's sometimes much less expensive, low dose, right, supportive interventions. And we're having, we're challenging ourselves here at OCFS about how do we do that, and knowing that a lot of these smaller agencies who are doing an amazing work, right, through their own contributions and getting $10 here and there, they can't wait to claim and get paid by the state 2 years later, right? How do we put money up front to make that investment? So I think just around all of this and getting back to making it real, the making it real, is not in a strategic plan. It's not in DCJS. It's not at OCFS, right? It's in these very real communities. And I just challenge all of us as we do this work, and like I said, including us at OCFS, about how do we meaningfully and authentically connect with communities, and not just with sort of these government structures that we've created.
Thank you, Sheila. So what I'm hearing so far is, that there's elements within each of these goals, because I also have on my second screen here, I have the action items as they live underneath each one of these goals. And I'm hearing sort of some of the action items emerging from what both Emily and Sheila so far have also stipulated, and Euphemia and Michelle have also outlined as potential areas of beginning prioritizations that we may want to do as a JAG. So one idea, go ahead, Bob.
Thank you, Eddie. Just one note in terms of, I'd like to see the JAG engage attorneys for the child uniformly throughout the state, and corp counsel county attorneys. I don't know how much outreach we've really done in terms of training. Judges have done a lot of training. Judge Mendelson, we've seen her during the summer. We participated, both Nina and I, OCFS, DCGS, have done a lot of training with the judges over the years. Doesn't mean we can't do more training, but we have never really been successful in engaging, I think, the attorneys for the child and the corporate counsel and the county attorneys. It strikes me that a large number of cases are weeded out in New York City by the corp counsel, but that doesn't seem to be true in the rest of the state. I'd also like to take a look at those cases and do more examination around the cases that are actually dismissed, because a lot of cases get all the way through the petition, and ultimately there's a large number dismissed by judges. But I'd like to learn more about those cases to see why they got as far as they did, and if there's something that we couldn't do, on the front end. I'm, of course, very aware of the importance of intake and adjustment. That's primarily the goal of the Policy Equity Academy. I continue to say that we need to look at eligibility and suitability. Eligibility is defined in statute. I think that's probably warrants revisiting. But the suitability is contained in the Uniform Court Rules. I think we ought to take a second look at that as well. Just a few comments.
Thank you, Bob. Others? So I'm a former high school social studies teacher, so I'm good with wait time.
Comfortable in silence there?
Comfortable with the silence, yes. I just take it as folks are mulling over their thinking, right? But I think we've definitely gotten some great thoughts around from folks so far around areas of prioritization. We wanted to kind of spur this conversation to at least give some beginning direction of what we want to sort of start doing moving forward in terms of bringing strategic action plan to fruition. But this is not going to be sort of the last opportunity. One of the things that we want to put forward is to send all of you as JAG members a survey that contains the goals and the various action items for you all to kind of, having all this information, to give you time to kind of digest everything and outline your own sort of, for lack of a better term, sort of what do you consider as sort of your, what you would identify or select as your sort of top 5 priorities for this year at this juncture that you would like to see the JAG kind of leverage forward. We want to make sure we get everybody's input to kind of leverage our prioritization, because this prioritization is really going to guide how the grants working group is going to work to sort of start generating, for lack of a better term, a menu of things that we want to offer up in December for the JAG to consider in relation to what we consider is our sets of prioritizations. So we want to make sure that we get your juices going here, but you're going to have an opportunity with the survey to really give more thoughts around sort of where you consider your sort of top 5 priorities.
Eddie, this is Mark White.
Hey, Mark.
How are you? Sorry, we're having some camera issues, but I do think it could be worth again examining when you look at law enforcement training, and I know we've talked a lot about implicit bias training, but to really figure out what we can have. Speaking from personal experience, from the time I turned 16 and can drive until I was 30, I can tell you at least a half dozen times, I've been stopped by the police to be asked, where are you headed? Do you have drugs in your car? What are you doing in this neighborhood? And never doing anything illegal. I just can't tell you, even to this point, right? As I later got in my career and joined probation, then they would say to me, how come you didn't tell us you were, probation supervisor? And to this day, when I drive a car and there's a police officer behind me, my heart drops. That's my first initial reaction. And I just can't impress on people, what it feels like when you're driving down the street and make eye contact with an officer and then he does a 360 and gets behind you and you've done nothing. So there's still something very, very wrong. I know we've tried to say, let's focus on implicit bias, but something needs to change here. Fortunately, it didn't lead to me ever being arrested or having any issues of that nature, but I can only imagine the number of people who get treated this way on a daily basis. And I don't have the solutions, but I can just tell you that something is very wrong and something needs to change, in that dynamic. And, the last thing I'll say is, I have a 17-year-old son who's driving, and I had to sit him down and tell him it's not if, it's when they are going to stop you, and try to prepare him as best I can, to make sure that he's okay. And so, something needs to change, because I don't know when it became that was commonplace and that's the right thing to do, when people haven't done anything. So again, I don't have the magic bullet, but it occurs to me, especially what we've been seeing, across the country in the last year or two, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, and there's still a lot going on in these communities that people just should not be subjected to.
Thank you, Mark. And particularly, thank you for highlighting, part of the dynamic that, or the narrative that we're always very careful about is reconciling that as we look at these data patterns, that there isn't a sort of a narrative that runs alongside of the they must have done something, right? Like we've got to recognize that there's some of this stuff also can transpire in the midst of something not having occurred. So thank you for sort of reminding us of that.
I just want to lift up sort of two things, and one is really jumping off from what Mark you just shared and what you just said, Eddie, that it's also a question of just because something can be handled through the juvenile justice system because technically an offense has occurred, is it the most effective? Does it contribute to well-being, community safety, and those questions of who gets that pass and who does not? I think we're very clear on that. But I think really lifting up the base question about why do people seek this path simply because it's available to address behavioral issues, particularly on the misdemeanor side. I just, those misdemeanor differences in rest of state, they rattle me. That so many young people who probably could be addressed, their behavior or the concern, assuming they did it in the first place, could be addressed through other means. I think there's a huge disparity about which road gets taken. And I think the other thing that's very important for us to be thinking about as funders is the whole issue both of collaboration and sustainability. That one of the things that we heard does often more damage than good is when you have these pots of money that float down, people start something, the money goes away, and the community is left with nothing, particularly at the hyperlocal level. So as we are thinking about ways to spend our money, I think we really have to pay attention to, really making sure we're not setting up false expectations. And how do we put sustainability in place, and how do we encourage collaboration, particularly if there are those larger not-for-profits that often take all the money because they have great grant writers, right? Who can be a source of stability, right? And make sure that they are sharing some of that wealth and partnering with the very small, very grassroots folks who know how to reach the kids and the families, but don't have the time to hire or money to hire a grant writer.
Right. Thank you for that, Nina. So speaking of grants, one of the tools, and I'm trying to be mindful of time so that we can end on time, is that that we've outlined is, and we talked about it in our last meeting, and we've moved further along in terms of the grants working group, and as a tool for supporting the prioritization of the JAG. And we've reached out to, as you all remember, we had devised sort of action groups back in January, and we did a lot of different sets of outreach to get a variety of folks to volunteer. And because we did not move forward on that, we really took earnestly the volunteerism that appeared from that endeavor, and we reached out to the similar set of folks who were representative of not only just JAG, but also the various stakeholders that we're in community with, and reached out to a variety of folks from that to see if they wanted to continue this volunteerism energy that they had, and asking them if they would participate in the grants working group. So we have gotten members already, and always open to have others who are in a volunteerism mode and would like to participate. in the grants working group, but not required. But the group would serve as a tool to really help support the moving the action items to further action of the JAG. So Tom is going to give us just a little bit of sort of highlights of what we covered as a grants group and what are some of our next steps, and see if anyone has any questions.
Sure. Thanks, Eddie. And, for those of you who were on the, at the first meeting, feel free to chime in. But, the way we sort of moved forward in setting it up is, we tried to be representative of, government, non-government, and then youth members. So to begin with, we have two of each on the working group. We have Eddie and Brendan, I believe it is for non-government. We have Bob and Alan for government. And then we have Jason and Nyasia for the youth members. To begin with, and as Eddie said, if there's anybody else that's interested in participating, certainly feel free to reach out. But the idea is to really kind of work through the prioritization of the plan. At the staff level, we will be really doing a lot of the legwork in trying to come up with some specific thoughts for the group to react to pull together some proposals with details on, how much money do we think it's going to cost? What would it be? What types of things do we think we could do from a practical standpoint? All that stuff to, then work with the grants working group and thinking about how to prioritize those things, add some things that they think we might need to also focus on, bring that back to the full JAG at the following meeting. So the idea is for the group to really meet shortly after each JAG meeting to talk through some of those things, to go back to the JAG with some specifics, get feedback, and then that would sort of continue. And at the staff level, we'll also be working on a more detailed kind of tracking sheet that includes not only the funding options for the JAG, but to make sure that we're moving forward on some of the other items that may or may not necessarily take funding, right? Like disseminating the information, working to align efforts a little bit better. There are some things, right, that aren't going to take money. I think we talked about JAG representation on the Partnership for Youth Justice. We talked about some other items that don't necessarily take money. So that's the approach that that I think that we are planning to start with. But I'll kind of turn to any of the members who were at that first meeting, or Damon, to add to that. Anything else that I'm missing here?
Other than, Emily just volunteered. Love this volunteerism. Thank you, Emily. I believe, if I remember correctly, at our exec meeting, I think Michelle also offered to volunteer, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
So any thoughts or reactions around the working group, the grants working group? Any further clarification that folks need?
So, yes, I raised my hand to be in the group. I do grant making for a living. So I feel like, I maybe can add something to this this group. Are we going to be bringing proposals to the JAG in December? Is that the go? You know, is this group going to actually have some proposals on the table, ready to vote on? Because we have money to be spent, right? So I'd love to see that, you know, put out there as quickly as we can.
I think those are things we're going to work through, and you know, and once we start to flesh out some specifics, we'll have a better idea of whether there will be anything that's ready to vote on in December. But you know, I think we have to certainly have that conversation about where we are, and we're very cognizant of, you know, of the timing of the funding, you know, what the expiration dates are and all those things. So we also want to make sure that we're, you know, thoroughly going through and making sure that we're well prepared to be able to execute what we pull together as well. So, you know, that's why I'm being just a little hesitant on saying, yeah, for sure we'll have something in December or not.
Yeah.
Do you think it makes sense to have somebody from the Youth Justice Institute on this group as well? I mean, I think that could be a value add.
I think the Institute is going to be included in many of the details that we are going to be doing in terms of working on proposals and things like that. We know that they're well positioned to know what the best practices are in the field and all of that. You know, I'll defer to others. I'll defer to others as to whether there would be specific representation on the group, but I know that we'll be working very closely with them regardless.
Yeah. So you know, so Emily, yes. So you know, YJI, you know, it's definitely is an important information hub, and we want to leverage their sort of tools and knowledge into as we put our, you know, what we put together as a working group. And the other sort of component in terms of the potential December, I think the hesitation is also around the status of funding, you know, where we were at. And I think that was sort of a little bit of the hesitation. I think there's still a little bit more clarification that needs to occur before we can definitively be ready for moving this forward. But you're right. Once we get the all clear, we've got to be ready to run. So to move these action items forward. So I want to be cognizant of the fact that we are at 1 o'clock and folks are jumping off like you know, there's a hot event that's happening that they got to run to. So.
I wish I knew where that was.
So any last thoughts? Right. So could I get a motion to adjourn? Emily, 1. Can I get a second? Whoever's left.
Sorry, we don't have a quorum, so we can't adjourn the meeting.
I know I got Jason. So all in favor? Those of us who are still here?
Aye.
Right. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Enjoy your Tuesday.
All right. Thank you.
All right.